He didn't know where he was born, only that he was left beside a dying horse during the last snow of spring. The townsfolk called him River Boy, not out of kindness, but because they found him near the current, soaked and silent. He never spoke of his past, because he had none. He cleaned stalls for supper, slept in the hay, and grew up watching other boys get names, fathers, and futures. All he had was the river, and a question that never stopped echoing in his chest. Why was I left behind? One morning, as the water ran clearer than usual, he spotted something wedged between two rocks. At first, he thought it was just debris, but when he pulled it free, his breath caught. A necklace, braided leather, with a turquoise stone that pulsed like it held a heartbeat of its own. It didn't belong to any white man. It was old, sacred, alive. He should have sold it, or at least hidden it. But something inside him stirred, an instinct not born of logic but blood. He knew exactly where he had to take it. The Apache didn't welcome strangers, especially not boys with dirty boots and no lineage. But he walked across their land anyway, head bowed, necklace held out like an offering. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He simply stood, and they didn't shoot. They watched. They studied. And then, one of them, a woman with a face carved from stone and eyes soft as dusk, stepped forward and took the necklace from his hands. She turned to the circle of warriors behind her and said only one word: return. What happened next would become a whisper in the canyons, a fireside tale among scouts and cowboys. They didn't hurt him. They didn't test him. They invited him, not into their homes, but into something far deeper, a circle older than any town, a ritual that few outsiders had ever witnessed. That day, the orphan with no name knelt in dust and firelight and was given something far greater than food or shelter. He was given belonging, and the West would never see him the same again. They didn't speak his name because he didn't have one. Not at first. Among the Apache, a name was not given lightly. It was earned, witnessed, sung. That first night in their camp, the orphan sat in silence while the fire crackled like bones whispering. The air smelled of cedar, smoke, and memory. Warriors carved tools without looking at him. Children stared, then disappeared behind hides. Only the elder woman who had accepted the necklace acknowledged him, offering a single blanket and a space beside the outer ring of the flame. He didn't ask questions. He only listened. The circle was sacred. He learned that quickly. Not just a formation, but a force. No man stepped into it without permission. Stories were told in it. Decisions were made inside it. And once a month, under the black sky when the moon fled, a ritual took place. One that called down voices older than language. He was not invited. But on the seventh day, the same woman, called Chinoa by those around her, motioned for him to follow. No words, just a nod. That was how the wild taught, with motion, not noise. She took him to the river, the same one where he'd found the necklace. But now it looked different, wider, deeper, as if holding back secrets. There, she gave him a task: gather white stones with sharp edges, 7 of them, and place them in a circle. He obeyed, hands bleeding from the jagged cuts. He returned with the stones and laid them as told. Then she pulled the necklace from beneath her garments, held it to the sun, and chanted in a tone that didn't belong to just her. It belonged to the wind. He didn't understand the words, but his skin prickled with something deeper than fear. Reverence. The moment the chant ended, a hawk cried above them and circled once, only once, before vanishing behind the cliffs. Chenoa turned to him and placed the necklace around his neck. You found what was lost, she said. Now, you carry what must not be forgotten. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a transfer. Of weight. Of memory. Of legacy. That night, for the first time, he was invited into the circle. Not as a guest. Not as a boy. But as one of them. Being part of the circle didn't mean safety. It meant responsibility. He was awakened before dawn, tasked with gathering roots from thorn bushes, learning to track animals not for the hunt, but for understanding how they moved, why they paused when they knew danger before it showed. Chenoa taught him through riddles, never explanations. What you can name, you can lose, she'd say. But what you feel, you carry even when silence falls. The warriors still kept their distance. Some glared with distrust. One even spat near his feet and muttered ghost steps, a term for those who walk between worlds but belong to neither. But he never answered with words. Instead, he outlasted them in the tasks. Climbed higher, ran farther, stayed silent longer. And slowly, the resentment turned to something else, caution mixed with curiosity. They began to leave him pieces of advice in the form of stories, told not to him, but near him, a sideways kind of teaching. Apache wisdom wore many masks. One evening, a child from the tribe fell sick. Fever, shaking, breath shallow like a broken whistle. The tribe's healer had gone hunting 3 days prior. Panic crept in, and it was then the boy remembered something. An herb Chenoa had shown him once, growing near the edge of the river where reeds whispered and frogs went silent. Without permission, without escort, he ran. He returned hours later, drenched and scratched, holding a bundle of the same leaves she once placed in his hand. They boiled the herb, fed it to the child drop by drop. No chants, no grand declarations. Just waiting, watching. And when morning broke, the child stirred, coughed, and reached for water. A wave of breath passed through the camp. Not relief, recognition. The boy, once a shadow, had become something else. A thread in the weave, a voice in the circle. That night, the chief approached him, not with ceremony, but with a question. "Who gave you your name?" the old man asked. The boy hesitated, then answered, "The river." The chief nodded, and from that moment forward, no one called him Orphan again. They called him Tahani, Riverborn, the boy who brought back the necklace and returned the spirit of something ancient to the tribe. Tahani's days took on a rhythm older than time itself. Mornings began with the breath of the earth, bare feet in soil, eyes closed to the wind. Midday brought labor, skinning hides, collecting firewood, observing the old warriors as they painted symbols on stones before battle drills. But the nights belonged to the stories. Around the fire, voices rose with smoke, carrying tales of warriors who turned into storms, of women who sang rivers into changing their course, of spirits who watched from the tops of cliffs waiting to test the hearts of men. He never spoke during these nights, not out of shyness, but reverence. Words were currency, and he had not yet earned the weight of a story. But the elders noticed how he listened, how he leaned toward the flames, not for warmth, but for truth. Chenoa once whispered to him, "The ears of the forgotten hear louder than drums." And he began to understand, his silence was not weakness. It was a vessel, and one day it would pour something powerful. Then came the trial. Not spoken, not announced. It came in the form of a disappearance. A child, no older than 5 summers, vanished during a dust storm while chasing a feather. The entire camp erupted in emotion, but no tracks could be found. No cries echoed. The wind had erased every trace. While others searched the plains, Tahani stood still. He closed his eyes, gripped the necklace, and listened, not with his ears, but with what he had come to call the deep sense, a knowing that spoke beneath thought. He moved west, against all advice, toward a canyon forbidden since the time of the ancestors. Legends said it swallowed men whole. But he didn't hesitate. With each step, the air grew colder, heavier, almost whispering. At the edge of the canyon, he paused, and there, nestled beneath a fallen root, eyes wide but alive, was the child. He carried her back wrapped in his own cloak. Not a word spoken, but when he returned, the fire-keepers stopped their songs. The warriors lowered their heads, and Chenoa placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "The circle has spoken." From that day forward, he was no longer merely Riverborn. He became the one who returned from silence. And that night, for the first time, they asked him to speak. One story, one truth. And as he sat by the fire, flames reflecting in his eyes, he began not with pride, but with a whisper. "The river taught me to give back what I was never given." And the circle leaned in to listen. Seasons changed, wind shifted, and with time, Tahani grew not only in age, but in presence. He had become a bridge between youth and elder, silence and story, the seen and the unseen. Strangers who wandered near the edge of Apache land no longer received arrows first. Sometimes they saw him before they saw the warriors, and his eyes alone were enough to make them lower their weapons. Because he didn't speak with threat, he spoke with truth, and in the West, truth was more feared than steel. But with reverence came risk. A group of riders came one dusk, white men with heavy rifles and heavier egos. Traitors, they claimed, but their saddlebags said otherwise. Pelts stained with fresh blood, relics taken from sacred grounds, bones still strung with offerings. The Apache watched silent. The air thickened like a storm before the thunder. Tahani stepped forward, the only one who spoke their tongue. "This land is not for sale," he said. The leader laughed, spat, and reached for the necklace around Tahani's neck. He never touched it, because before his hand reached halfway, the wind howled, and from the shadows, the warriors appeared. Dozens, painted, armed, waiting. But it was Tahani who raised a hand, not in surrender, but in judgment. "Leave now," he said, "and do not return. This land remembers faces." And for the first time in their lives, the men saw something in his eyes that even their bullets couldn't break. History, lineage, belonging. They turned their horses, left without a fight. The land remained untouched. That night, no songs were sung, no drums were played. Only the fire burned, and in that fire, Chinoa placed a single feather, black with a white tip. "The raven flies backward," she said, "but sees all that's ahead." She handed it to Tahani, not as a token, but as a charge, a mantle, a symbol that the boy once abandoned by the river had now become a guardian of not just the tribe, but of memory itself. And though he still rarely spoke, when he did, the West listened. Years passed like wind carving stone, slow, unseen, but unrelenting. Tahani's hair darkened with streaks of gold from the sun, his shoulders broadened, and his eyes deepened like wells that had tasted both shadow and light. The necklace he once offered was no longer just around his neck. It was braided into his very spirit. Travelers spoke of him not as a boy, but as a myth. Some called him the silent healer. Others, the boy who found the circle. But in the tribe, he was simply Tahani, proof that the land could reclaim its forgotten sons. The river still called to him. He visited it at dawn, barefoot, letting its current speak without words. One morning, as he kneeled at its edge, a small pouch washed up at his feet, tied in hide, sealed with soot. Inside, a broken arrowhead and a faded map drawn in ash. It wasn't from the Apache. It was from the outside, from before. Someone had remembered him, or perhaps someone had never stopped watching. He didn't tell Chenoa. Not yet. He tucked the pouch into his belt and walked back in silence. That night, as the stars blinked above the canyon, Chenoa approached him alone. "You've walked the inner path," she said, "but the outer winds are rising." She placed her hands over his chest, just above the necklace. "The river gives, but it also returns. You must follow where it points." He nodded, but his heart tightened. He had lived for the tribe, bled for it, grown through its soil. The thought of leaving was like tearing bark from tree. But the land never promised comfort, only purpose. The next morning, the tribe gathered around the fire in silence. No one asked why he saddled his horse. No one questioned the spear strapped to his back or the medicine pouch at his hip. Chenoa handed him a bundle, dried herbs, raven feathers, and the last stone from the original circle. "Where you go," she whispered, "we follow in spirit." One by one, the warriors raised their hands, not in farewell, but in reverence. He wasn't leaving them. He was extending them into the unknown. As he rode out past the boundary stones, the sun split the sky in gold and crimson. The land stretched before him, not as threat, but as invitation. The boy who once had no name, no home, no voice, now carried a legacy older than nations. And wherever the river would take him next, he would not arrive as a stranger. He would arrive as a son of the circle. Tahani rode for 3 days without seeing a soul. Only dust, distant vultures, and the echo of hooves against stone. On the 4th morning, he found the valley, exactly as it had appeared on the faded map. Trees blackened from old fire, a split boulder that looked like a serpent's head, and at the base of the canyon wall, half buried in roots and moss, the remains of what once had been a shelter. Not Apache, but white-built. The edges were worn, the wood cracked, but something still lingered. Inside, he found the name Elias carved into the wall, a name he didn't remember, but his blood did. He found a small wooden horse beneath a collapsed shelf, with a turquoise bead tied to its tail. The same color as the one in his necklace. A memory stirred. A woman's voice humming. A hand brushing dirt from his cheek. The face was gone, but the warmth remained. This place wasn't a discovery. It was a return. As the wind picked up, he built a small fire in the ruins. He didn't light it for warmth. He lit it for calling. The Apache believed fire invited spirits, not just of the dead, but of memory itself. As the flames danced, he placed a stone from the circle at the fire's edge, just as Chenoa had shown him. He whispered nothing. The land already knew. And as the night fell, shadows moved differently. Not with menace, but with recognition. At dawn, footsteps approached. Not soft, not cautious, confident. From the ridge, a man appeared, older, wrapped in leather and dust, with eyes sharp as crows. He looked at Tahani and didn't speak for a long time. Then finally said, "You found it." Tahani nodded. "I remembered it." The man walked down the slope and sat near the fire. They didn't need introductions. Sometimes, blood speaks louder than names. They shared no food, only silence and story. The man, Elias, told of a child taken during a raid, lost in the chaos of retreat, presumed dead. A mother who wept herself into silence. A father who spent years carving maps into ash and sending them down rivers. Tahani listened, not with his ears, but with the soul of the boy who had once watched the same river and wondered who had forgotten him. Now he knew. He hadn't been forgotten. He had been sent ahead. Elias stayed only one night. Before dawn, he left without waking Tahani, leaving behind a single item, a piece of cloth wrapped around a tooth, carved from stone, with the same spiral symbol Chenoa had once painted in the dust. It was old, possibly older than either of them, but Tahani understood its meaning without words. This was not just about blood ties. It was about sacred ones. The river had connected them not for reunion, but for continuation. And now, something larger was moving beneath the earth. Something that would call on every piece of him, Apache, Orphan, Air. He returned to the ruins daily, clearing them bit by bit. Not to rebuild, but to remember. Each broken beam, each forgotten carving told stories of a time when settlers and tribes still walked separate paths, sometimes with hatred, sometimes with hope. Among the wreckage, he found a page torn from an old Bible, weathered, brittle, but intact. On the edge, a child's drawing, a necklace, a river, a circle. And suddenly, he understood. The necklace hadn't just been lost. It had been sent, a message through time, a call to return not only to a place, but to a truth buried under generations of silence. As he worked, others began to arrive. First, a woman with burn scars on her hands and a pack of herbs slung over her shoulder. Then two boys who spoke a mix of Spanish and Apache. Then a scout with one eye, who said he followed a dream of fire that didn't burn. One by one, they found Tahani in the valley. Not because he called them, but because the land did. The circle, it seemed, had widened, and where once it had held only warriors, now it welcomed the lost, the wounded, the ones who had no place but were willing to become one. At night, they built a new fire. Not in the center, but around the edges, dozens of smaller flames, encircling the valley. Each person added something to the flame, a story, a token, a truth. And in those flames, Tahani saw what the circle had always meant. Not blood, not boundaries, but becoming. Every person, every memory, every scar, woven into one light that pushed back the dark. It was no longer a boy's story. It was theirs. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Tahani stepped into the center, not as the one chosen by the river, but as the one who now chose the path forward. But the West, as always, does not yield blessings without balance. Word of the gathering spread, not through letters or messengers, but through a tension in the wind, how the hawks flew lower, how the coyotes circled closer, how horses woke in the night for no reason. Those who still clung to fear and power, the men who traded sacred land for gold, who raided in shadows and drank from poisoned creeds, they began to take notice. To them, a circle was not a place of unity. It was a threat. One morning, smoke rose from the ridge to the east. A warning. When Tahani reached the crest, he saw the old oaks burning. A symbol. This land does not forget, etched in ash. The raiders had come, not with treaties or torches, but with words cloaked in authority. They wanted the land cleared. Too many gather, they said. Too much movement. Too many whispers. But Tahani knew the truth. They feared what they couldn't control, and the circle had become something untouchable. He gathered the others that night, not with shouts, but with quiet presence. Around the fire, he told them a story. Of the day he had found the necklace in the river. Of the moment he gave it away and received, in return, not possession, but belonging. This place, he said, is not a camp. It is not a protest. It is not a threat. It is a return. And you do not return to what is yours by asking permission. They didn't vote. They didn't argue. They simply stood, side by side, warrior beside healer, child beside elder, story beside silence. And when the riders came at dawn, they found no weapons. Only fires burning in a perfect ring. People standing still, eyes steady. Tahani stood in the center, necklace gleaming like a blue sun. The riders paused. They saw not an army, but something worse. Conviction. The riders hesitated, but only for a moment. Men who fed on fear mistook silence for surrender. One barked orders. Another raised a rifle. But before metal could meet flesh, the wind howled. Not as weather, but as warning. The ring of fire flared upward without touch. Horses reared. Flames bent inward, encircling the gathering in a column of light. The riders stopped. The lead man dismounted, stepped forward, and shouted, "What are you people?" Tahani stepped beyond the fire, not in defiance, but in truth. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. We are the memory you try to bury, the names your papers could never spell. We are the ones the land called home long before you carved it into squares. He held no weapon, only the necklace. And behind him, the circle pulsed, not with fire, but with presence. The kind of force no bullet can silence. The lead rider trembled, not from cold, but recognition. He'd heard the stories, the ones whispered in saloons and ranger camps, of the orphan who'd been taken by the Apache and returned with eyes like stormlight, of the boy who walked with ghosts and called rivers by name. He dropped his rifle, slowly, and without a word, he turned. The rest followed. Not one shot fired, not one hand raised. Because in the West, there are moments when legends stand tall enough to silence even cowards. When the dust settled, the circle didn't cheer. They didn't sing. They simply sat. Tahani knelt and touched the ground. Not victory, he whispered. Balance. That night, the fire burned blue. The stars fell closer. And in the quiet, even the crickets held pause. Something old had just been remembered. Not rewritten. Not claimed. Remembered. And in that remembering, the land seemed to breathe easier again. Months passed, but time in the circle didn't follow clocks. It followed truth. Crops grew stronger near the center. Animals wandered closer. Travelers came not for shelter, but for stories. And the land, scarred, burned, and once silenced, began to sing again. Children born into the circle learned to crawl toward the fire before they walked. Elders from distant nations arrived with songs not sung in decades. And through it all, Tahani remained at the center, not as a leader, but as a listener. He no longer needed to speak often. Others told the tales now, of how he gave a necklace to the Apache and was baptized by flame and silence, of how a boy with no name became a keeper of many. He smiled when he heard them, never correcting a detail. Because truth in the West isn't always about facts. It's about feeling. And the feeling was right. The circle had become more than a place. It had become a rhythm. One evening, a boy approached him, barefoot, mud on his knees, eyes full of questions. He held out a stone he'd found near the river. "Is this magic?" he asked. Tahani looked at it, then at the boy, and answered, "Only if you give it to someone." The boy nodded solemnly and ran off, clutching it like treasure. And Tahani smiled, because he knew the real power was never in the object. It was always in the offering. Years later, long after the first fire had turned to ash, and the first circle had given way to many more, people still told the story. Not of war, not of conquest, but of one quiet act. A necklace found, a people honored, a circle opened, and how, through that act, an orphan with nothing gave everything back to the land. And in doing so, became part of it forever. In the boundless silence of the West, where voices often vanish into dust and the forgotten rarely return, one boy did more than survive. He belonged. Not by force, not by birthright, but by a sacred act of giving. He found a necklace in a river and gave it away without asking for anything in return. And in doing so, the river gave him something the world had denied: a place, a name, a circle. Tahani's journey was never about reclaiming what he lost. It was about discovering what could never be taken from him. Through fire, silence, and shadow, he became more than the boy without a past. He became the memory of a people, the rhythm of a forgotten land. And while many seek greatness in conquest, he found it in humility, in offering, in listening. He didn't rise by stepping forward. He rose by kneeling, by feeling, by honoring what others feared. And that is where true strength lives, not in the shout, but in the stillness before it. The circle he helped form outlived fire, bullets, and borders. Not because it was protected, but because it was shared. Each person who entered it didn't just find shelter. They found meaning. A reminder that belonging isn't a matter of who you are. It's what you choose to carry, protect, and pass on. And in a world that often forgets, Tahani proved that remembrance is a form of resistance. So when the dust of your own life settles, and you find something, be it a memory, a chance, or a moment that others might ignore, don't just hold it. Offer it. Because sometimes, the smallest gesture becomes the spark that lights a legacy. And what you give freely may just become the very thing that saves someone else from disappearing. If this story stirred something in you, let it live a little longer. Subscribe to the channel to walk alongside more voices like Tahani's. Leave a like if his journey touched your heart, and share your reflections in the comments. Because every word, every thought, every fire we build together makes the circle stronger.